those are the things that the military does well. These are some of the things that the civilian world does well, which is an even greater value to the military nowadays, not just because of the stability and reconstruction piece, which is very important to things like counterinsurgency operations, disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, and so on, but even to the military operation of providing security. In this asymmetric environment that we find ourselves, the human factor becomes even more important to such things as information and intelligence. Well, if you want to understand the actual operational environment, which is the civilian population at hand and the culture involved, then you need to go to the people who have a far more intimate understanding of that. And a lot of the NGOs and private voluntary organizations and private sector companies have a much better understanding of that than certainly the military. Next slide. Another capability that obviously is near and dear to my heart is civil affairs, and I simply won't go into that because that's a subject in and of itself. But I think we tend to forget that civil affairs is the perfect example of the strategic corporal, where it is an essentially strategic capability, a strategic activity being conducted at the tactical level. There are only about 8,000, and that's actually a recent uptick, civil affairs people in the Army and Marines and some in the Navy now. That still constitutes 0.5% of the total U.S. military. So only 0.5% of the U.S. military is actually dedicated to this transition from military-led operations to civilian-led efforts. That's kind of remarkable. Civil affairs is probably one of the 5 busiest specialties in the military, no doubt, in terms of operational tempo, and 90% of them are reserve component. That's also very interesting. Our partners around the world have also latched onto this idea. In fact, earlier this year I was consulting with a group of folks from the United Kingdom to stand up a civil affairs capability. In fact, for those of you who know me, I commanded the 1st Civil Affairs Battalion to go to Iraq, and one detachment that I sent out for the first 6 months of the war provided the 1st UK their entire civil affairs capability. And it was a remarkable experience and a lot of lessons learned both ways. But our allies are also picking up on this. And I would submit to you, and this is something I'm beginning to just write about, I would submit to you that when you're doing things like DDR, you better have as one of your lines of operations in building a capacity within those militaries is some kind of CIMIC or civil affairs capability, because it's a shortcut not only to helping to introduce all of those civilian capabilities, but it actually helps to democratize the country. If a commander is obviously sensitive to the civilian population from an operational perspective, he's probably going to be sensitive to it from a political perspective. Next slide. And again, I won't belabor PRTs. That's going to be discussed at great length tomorrow. But the PRTs are kind of the CMOCs of this decade. Back in the 1990s when Somalia kicked off and we had a CMOC in Somalia, and CMOCs back then were kind of like what Admiral Halsey talked about, logistics. They didn't know what it was, but they sure wanted one. And everybody wants a PRT now, and that's a good thing. But I would point out to you, just like the CMOCs, until very recently with changes in the Army doctrine, they are not a doctrinal organization. And for those of us in the Department of Defense world, that is important because it's about budgeting, it's about authorization, it's about programming, it's about resources. Until they become doctrinal, and I would submit they should be doctrinal at the interagency level, you cannot commit resources, it's simply ad hoc, and that's exactly where we're finding ourselves. So the PRT effort, while it's a good thing, is also instructive in that this is something, again, that needs to be deliberate and not simply ad hoc. Next slide. So, if you will, the cooperation and coordination between the military and the private sector is really not just a necessity, it is an inevitability. Regardless of whether you're talking about private military companies or you're talking about development assistance. The good news, again, is both the ways and means are growing indirectly through your agency process and in direct relationships and initiatives that are occurring between the private sector and the military. The doctrinal and private sector business practices and models, however, need to continue to evolve to cover many of those gaps that Al pointed out. And I would also submit that it's not just about post-conflict. The future of this relationship, after all, is really not in engagements like Afghanistan and Iraq, which are quickly becoming legacy operations, if you will, but in preventative engagements, as was pointed out this morning by Tom. And AFRICOM is going to be a very interesting study, I think, in that effort. And as I've mentioned before, what's key here is this ground-up level. And it's really not just getting about, for the business world, it's really not just about getting in on the ground floor, which you certainly can understand. It's creating it. And the only way that you can do that is through those kinds of synergistic efforts taking place between the public and private sectors, in uniform and in coats and ties. And last but not least, as was brought up before, we are going to have to adapt these methodologies and strategies and find these ways and means and improve them and perfect them and have more forethought about them. Not simply because it's a good thing to do because the operational and strategic environment calls for this, but because we will not be able to afford any other way. Big hammer is too expensive. The next government that comes in is going to inherit a significant resource problem, and particularly looking at budgets. And there are going to be some very, very difficult choices being made by the next government, regardless of which party takes over. And we have to simply find better ways to do this.